This is my favorite comment of the month. Cam, you're like the king of the redneck all-American storytelling. Your platform is for we the common folks, and we love to listen to you tell your tales. Thanks for all the work you've done and put into it. That's right. This is a blue-collar storytelling channel. I had a judge comment, I think this morning. He said not just rednecks listen to your stories, but I bet that judge has a little bit of redneck in him too. What do y'all think? Come on. Hey, if you guys like weird, strange stories, then you found your people, and I'm welcoming you to this channel. Now I'm going to shut up and we're going to move on. You're going to hear 3 stories. All right, here we go. This is an email about Bigfoot. And the writer says, my siblings call me Buckshot. I guess you can tell by that name that I've spent most of my life in the woods, hunting everything from white-tailed deer to turkey to coyotes and hogs. And because of that, I've also spent many an early morning and night listening to the sounds of Mother Nature. Where I'm from, coyotes are pretty common and black bears aren't unheard of. We also have black panthers or black cougars here, but don't tell the authorities. They ain't figured it out yet. I know I haven't seen or heard everything, but I've always been pretty comfortable with my knowledge of Mother Nature. That's why I was so shook up by what I heard one night a few weeks back. I was sitting in my barn taking a rest before heading to the house when out of the blue I heard an extremely loud roar. Or I guess you might say it was a yell. But whichever it was something I've never heard before. I've heard everything that might have come close to it, but this wasn't any of them, I'm sure of that. There's something else I'm sure of. Whatever made that noise was huge. The sound repeated itself 3 more times. With each successive yell, my heart beat a little faster, until it felt like it was beating out of my chest. I retreated to the house as quickly as I could. Since then, I carry whenever I step outside, especially late at night. So naturally, I told my dad and sister and nephew about it, and just as naturally, they laughed and picked fun at me for it. After a week of being mocked by them, we were all sitting out in the yard one night enjoying the evening air. It was getting to be around 11:40 p.m. and I was half listening for another yell and half hoping I didn't hear one. Just as my dad opened his mouth to say something, that loud bellowing howl came from the woodline along the backfield of my property. In the daylight, we could have seen where it came from, but at night it was too dark. As that sound echoed across the barnyard, everyone went still. My dad froze in mid-word and his eyes bulged from his face. We all sat looking at each other as that same sound came from the bowels of the woods a few more times over the next several minutes. No one spoke a word, probably because no one needed to. That effectively ended our night. The next night, we regrouped in the barnyard with everyone anxious to talk about what happened the night before. As my dad and siblings discussed the loudness and the possible source of the sounds, my nephew and I searched the internet on our smartphones looking for animal sounds that might explain what we'd heard. We searched for several hours, but we came up empty. Nothing came close to what we'd heard. Then we stumbled across a site that had Bigfoot sounds. They were remarkably close to what we'd heard. After hearing those recordings, we all looked at each other and came to the same collective conclusion. That thing roaring in my woods had to be a Bigfoot. A few days after that, my nephew and I were walking in a field on my property when he came across an unusual track in the soil. He called me over to look at it. What I saw led me to conclude that it was definitely a Bigfoot. The print was very human in appearance, except that it was 6 or 7 inches wide at the top and 4 to 5 inches wide at the heel. I could see the toes and the curve of the arch in the foot. My heart was racing as fast as it was that first night. I've always believed in the possibility of their existence, but I never thought I would actually see a print or hear one yell. A few nights passed, and I was standing out on my front porch to catch a bit of fresh air before turning in for the night, and from the woods across the road from my house, I heard that roar again. Having heard it several times now, I wasn't so quick to retreat. It was a little different this time, more like a squeal of pain with a hint of a roar in it. Fear gripped me, but I was determined to stand my ground. My wife heard it and came outside to see what it was. This was the first time she'd heard it, and I could see fear and worry in her eyes as she stood there in shock. 2 nights later, my son and I were out checking my grapes at 8 p.m., and I was studying how many grapes were producing when I heard that familiar sound in the distance. I marveled at the power it had even from so far away. With wide eyes, my son looked at me and he said, "Is that what you've been hearing?" And I nodded my answer as he turned to run for the house. "Come inside," he called over his shoulder, and I followed on his heels. A couple of more days went by with no unusual sounds from the woods. I had just gotten comfortable with the idea that we wouldn't hear any more of those yells, when as my wife and I were lying in bed that night, somewhere between awake and dreamland, and a loud bellow came through our bedroom window and rattled our walls. We both immediately sat upright in bed and looked around, neither one knowing what to say. All we could do was stare at each other when another loud roar shook the window glass. After that, all was silent for the rest of the night. It was just enough to keep either one of us from getting a good night's sleep, and we spent the rest of the night sitting up, waiting and listening. By now, I was contemplating looking for more evidence. Despite my internal struggle between fear and curiosity, I decided to take a walk along my property line at the edge of the woods. This time, I found 2 different sets of prints. One was 15 inches long and the other was 10 inches. Both were very wide, and I realized then that I was going to have to accept that whatever this was, it had chosen to make my property its home. Judging by the size of the prints and the strength of its roar, there wasn't going to be much I could do about it. I told my siblings about the prints the first chance I got. They all ran over to look at them, but I could tell that they were struggling with the same internal battle between curiosity and fear that had me tied in knots. I've lived on this property for the last 6 years. Before that, I lived 5 miles from here. And I've lived in this general area my entire 31 years. And never have I heard anything like this. I'm sure my siblings could all say the same. That night, after I showed my siblings the prints, we all decided to wait up to see if we might hear it again. The neighbor, who was living 3 houses down, was having a shindig that night, and around 9 p.m. the creature in the woods let loose with a long bellowing yell, and the neighbor heard it. How do I know that he heard it? Not 2 seconds later, all of his friends started leaving in a hasty manner. The fire went from lighting up his yard to darkness, and I laughed a bit, but I understood their fear. So far, it's the last time I've heard that yell. I can't remember when I got this. I'm kind of reaching back and pulling some of these up that I haven't gotten to yet. So I wish I had the date on this, but I don't. But I'd be curious to know if he's heard it anymore. Man, this is interesting. And thank you to the writer for sending it. I appreciate you. Here is an email, and the person doesn't give his name, so I don't know who they are, but here's what they write. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. I had no experience with the real outdoors growing up. All my activities took place inside the city limit. I never considered the unseen world as anything more than fantasy. I'm not a believer in conspiracy theories. I think most things can be explained by science or sound reasoning. Sometimes 2 plus 2 really does equal 4. After graduating from high school, I became a little less sheltered, maybe even a bit more open-minded. I met my wife, who had a love for these topics I either dismissed or had little interest in. She shared a few stories with me that happened while she was growing up, like the abandoned garage where the neighbor's kids claimed a pair of bright red glowing eyes would stare at them from the window. The old two-story house where she lived with her family had a basement that had been dug out after the place had been constructed around the year 1900. It had a dirt floor and the foundation was starting to sag. There was a section that had an inlet crawl space. When she aimed a flashlight into it, she could see nothing but cobwebs. One day her mother sent her to the basement to retrieve some canned goods sitting on a metal shelf. Her arms were loaded down with baked beans when she looked up and saw a pair of red glowing eyes looking at her from within the crawl space. She let out a scream, dropped the canned goods, and fled to the safety of the first floor. Her father's response was to hang a few more lights from the basement rafters. My wife and I were visiting her mother one evening shortly after we were married. The two of them left to visit a relative on the other side of town, leaving me alone to watch the television. Well, maybe it was a mix of hearing my wife's scary stories and the power of suggestion, but I thought I heard something rumbling around in the basement. There was a loud crash, and I immediately thought about the metal shelf of canned goods. So I opened the door leading to the basement and reached for the light switch. The lone bulb hanging over the steps flickered and went out. And I peered down the stairwell into the darkness, and I saw two red glowing eyes staring back at me. And I slammed the door and ran to my car, and I fled to a nearby fast food joint. My in-laws were not bothered in the least by my story. They righted the toppled shelving unit, restacked the cans, and changed the bulb over the stairs. Critters was all they said. Since then, I've had what you call a heightened awareness of my surroundings. I readily admit that there are things in life that can't be explained, though I'll always believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, sir, that's very good reasoning, because 2 plus 2 does equal 4, and sometimes there is a rational explanation for this. Could that have been like a raccoon or something? I don't know. I'm trying to, and I've said this before, but I can't remember what animal's eyes glow red when you shine light in them. However, he wasn't shining a light down in this basement. I'm assuming his wife wasn't either when she saw this, and the kids in the neighborhood who have seen it. But I know when he went in, the light bulb went out, so there's no light to reflect off the animal's, that back mirror part of their eye. I can't remember what it's called, but it reflects. It's how they gather light to see at night. Do any of those reflect back red? I can't remember. I think raccoons maybe? I don't know. Maybe some birds of prey. Maybe an owl? Maybe that's what that was. And maybe it was some kind of creature that lives in the crawl space, in the ductwork in her parents' house. Either way, it was a scary story, and it was very well written, and I loved it. I love these stories, so I appreciate the writer. Thank you. Okay, here's a good Bigfoot story. The writer, let's keep his name anonymous. Every year on Memorial Day, my extended family would have a get-together at a park near Parkersburg, West Virginia. That's my hometown. These were organized by my mother and usually drew about 50 people. The park itself is huge, amounting to about 3,000 acres. We would secure the biggest spot on the grounds, and my mother would prepare the grill while guests brought in Tupperware items like salads and casseroles. We got there early in the morning for all the preparation ahead of the people arriving at lunchtime. It was 1997. I was 11. My friends and I liked to explore the nearby woods. The area was so vast that sometimes we would get lost, but always managed to find our way back. I don't think it would have occurred to any of the adults to call for a search party unless we were still gone by the time it grew dark. Man, have times changed. I remember we were deep in the woods by a pond with a circumference of 50 yards. My friend and I were fast walking. He rushed past me and put a little distance between us. We were on an incline, so I aimed my eyes downward and started walking faster. and I stumbled into him a few yards up the trail, not expecting him to be standing stock still in the path. He directed my attention to something on the other side of the pond. It looked like a person, but it had a lot of hair, and it wasn't wearing any clothes. I didn't even know what to think. I'd never heard of a thing called Bigfoot or Sasquatch up until this point. I'd seen the movie Planet of the Apes on cable, and that's what I was thinking as both of us stood staring at this thing that was staring back at us. It wasn't much taller than my friend, who, if I was to guess, was 5 foot without shoes on. This thing had light brown hair all over with none on its face, which looked like something more like an ape, but less like a human. Its eyes were brown, and it just looked at me with no expression. Then it let out a yell and bounded away from the pond. We started running for the safety of my mother and our get-together, scared out of our 11-year-old minds. After some hardcore sprinting, it occurred to us that we hadn't a clue which direction we were heading. We were lost, and out of fear, we started arguing. It's this way. No, it's this way. At that point, I let out an expletive and just started running. My friend reluctantly followed behind. We emerged from the woods in a totally unfamiliar part of the park. Unfortunately, there were some people picnicking there. Me being the more extroverted of the two of us, I walked over to them and told them that we were lost and asked if they could help us. It took 30 minutes of driving around the park, but we pulled up to our picnic site. We'd been gone for hours, but we hadn't been missed. My friend liked to tell the story of our encounter more than I did. No matter how serious or straight-faced we were, people laughed it off. While I responded to the ridicule by dropping the matter altogether, my friend turned the whole thing into a comedy routine. If you believed his version, the thing we saw became the little brother we never had. I guess it's not an easy-to-believe story. I never really heard of Bigfoot sightings in West Virginia up until then. Maybe in the 2000s that all changed. I guess some just keep what they know quiet because no one takes it serious. In the late 1990s, the internet wasn't a huge thing, especially for someone my age. No one had cell phones. Pictures and videos just weren't happening. It makes me wonder how many people saw things, but the technology didn't allow for them to record the evidence and prove that they weren't out of their minds. Or were just a couple of 11-year-olds too stupid to find their way out of the woods. You know, that's the end of the story. Regarding the, the images, okay, let me back up. I know we didn't have smartphones with video cameras in the 1990s. There were video cameras. They were those big block VHS machines you put on your shoulder, and I'm transferring a lot of those old VHS tapes to digital right now. I bought a little gadget, and it's got some software with it, and I'm taking old family videos and putting them over there. By the way, but that's not what I want to talk about. But even if people had all this technology that we are lucky to have today, they'd get the same pictures we get. Blurry pictures and nothing. We get nothing. Absolutely nothing. We need good definitive images and video of this thing to prove it exists. We actually need a body. We need a Bigfoot body to prove that this exists. It's just my opinion, but I thought this was a good story. This is another story where people remember back when they were kids and they had an experience, and all of a sudden it starts to come together as they get older, and it just makes perfect sense. They probably ran into a Bigfoot. All right, thanks for the story. Thanks for listening to the Common Folk Redneck Storytelling channel. I appreciate you clicking on the video. I'll try to be back with one tomorrow or the next day. Thank you all again, and we'll see you on the next one. Love you all.